Guys, the MeToo movement is nothing new. It only looks new to you, but it's not new. And false accusations have always been around. This is a recounting of the story of the Salem Witch trials, where a bunch of young girls accused members of their own community of the worst crimes, in which these people either suffered, incarceration or execution. And they did it without remorse. They did it because it was a form of power. It was flexing social dominance. Okay? Now, I know this is just him recounting the story, but make sure you understand this is real. Here it says Salem Witch trials. Who were the main accusers? Though adult women and a few men accused their neighbors of witchcraft, the core group of accusers were girls, young girls. Okay? Let's get this a little larger so we can read. The center of the trials were a core group of accusers, all girls and young women ranging from age of 9 to 20. Now, 9 being only a child, you can allow for it. But even then, the age of reasoning is what, 8? So even this 9-year-old girl knew what she was doing. She was watching people getting burnt at the stake or hung or whatever they did to them. And you can't make excuses for the 20-year-olds. Now, they screamed, writhed, barked, and displayed other horrifying symptoms they claimed were signs of satanic possession. Often referred to as the afflicted girls, they included members of prominent village families, right? They were from all spectrums, right? Some were from high end and some were from low end. It didn't matter where they came from, as well as domestic servants and refugees of King William's War. Exactly. Now,
in the winter of 1692, a group of 8 young girls.
Now, the thing is, here they are baffled because they don't want to admit female nature. Historians have offered numerous possible explanations for the Salem accusers' actions, including economic hardship. Yeah, but some of these girls were from prominent families, right? Deliberate fraud, yes. Mass hysteria, mental illness, or convulsive ergotism, a condition caused by a fungus that grows and rises on the grains. But the truth is undoubtedly more complex and impossible to know. No, this is them making excuses. The truth is very simple, and it is no. And matter of fact, that's why I'm going to play some of these stories right here. This is Edward D. French. He makes YouTube videos where he tells these stories. You might like him. I like his voice. But in any event, we'll go 145. And he does a very good job at explaining what went on in this story.
Bodies. No man dared look his neighbor in the face for fear of seeing there the mark of Satan. Salem and Ipswich jails were full to bulging with confessed or suspected witches, and the group of young girls and women who seemed particularly susceptible to malign influences was constantly augmented by new recruits.
This is important. They were augmented by new recruits. So some brazen individuals started doing this with the false accusations, and then others joined up because they wanted a slice of the pie. They wanted to have power over life and death of the people in their community. That is the sole motivation of this, period.
Children and girls who fell into fits cried aloud in terror at invisible phantoms which mocked them from the air, or fell writhing to the floor, tortured by invisible fingers which pinched them black and blue, or thrust pins and needles into their tender flesh till the red blood spurted from their wounds, staining their clothing and terrifying the beholders. The devil was loose. Everywhere he added to the number of his servants. Soon the entire settlement would lie beneath his dreadful domination. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, poor and friendless old women of Salem Village, had been denounced as witches and thrown.
Notice something. The girls aim for the lower branches first, and then they keep going up the ladder with it, right? They go for the lowest on the totem pole would have been widowers, older women who had no man looking after them, right? They were the first ones to get zapped.
Into jail. Tituba, the half-breed slave of the Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of Salem Village Church, had confessed herself a witch and been sent to Boston to be sold to another master.
So they went after the slave girls and the basically the spinsters first, right?
Giles and Martha Corey, substantial farmer folk dwelling in Salem Farms, where the town of North Peabody now stands, had been cried out against by the afflicted children and lay in jail awaiting execution. Still the tide of devilry ran higher and higher.
He's waiting execution. So these girls, and so let's face it, most of them are young women. They're in their late teens and up to 20. They were killing off the people in their own communities. These are the people they depend on to survive. Okay, so what they're saying in this piece of history is that women are willing to burn their own lives to the ground in order to exercise social dominance.
The children continued to denounce first one, then another of the neighbors as witches, for, it seemed, no sooner was one witch apprehended and lodged in prison than a dozen more arose to plague the people with the magic powers derived from Satan in return for their souls. Cotton Mather, doctor of divinity and eminent Boston preacher, had come to Salem to reinforce the Reverend Mr. Parris in his combat with the evil one.
Oh, by the way, Cotton Mather, people will no doubt try to say that he was using these girls, that they were tools for his end. But I'm telling you, it's the opposite. He was a tool used by them to exercise their social dominance, their deadly social dominance.
And the force of his sermons stirred the terrorized people to a fever pitch. Not one servant of Satan, not one brand out of hell's fire was to be allowed to remain in the midst of the congregation of the righteous. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, commanded Holy Scripture. Witches and wizards, be they poor, friendless old women, prosperous farmers, or substantial citizens of Salem itself, must be...
Yeah, even if they're substantial citizens, everyone was beneath these young girls. Young girls held the power in their society. And that is no different now, right, guys? And what you're seeing now is no different than back then.
Gathered into the meshes of the law's net and dealt with according to the dictates of Scripture. And now a shiver of surprise and incredulity ran through the dwellers of Salem Village. Rebecca Nurse, widely known and universally loved wife of Francis Nurse of Salem, had been denounced as a witch by the afflicted children. The farmstead on which the Nurses dwelt had been divided into parcels, Francis and Rebecca Nurse retaining the original home, while such of their 8 children as had married occupied smaller plots adjacent. The family, while not the richest in Salem, was one of the most highly respected and most contented in the neighborhood. Mrs. Nurse herself was a veritable mother of Israel. Nearly every person in Salem was beholden to her in some manner, for she had watched beside their beds of birth and death, nursed them in sickness, and comforted them in sorrow. No one had ever applied to her in vain for aid. No beggar had ever been turned hungry from her door. Her 71 years of life represented 71 years of blamelessness.
There you go. And that's where I'm going to stop it for this particular video of his. Because they just said, it doesn't matter how good you were as a person. When these young girls want to do you in, you're done. And society, this society, was allowing it. They were willing to sacrifice They were willing to sacrifice a good person just to pander to young girls. Society is a form of devil worship. That's what woman worship is, everybody. It's a form of devil worship. Now, we'll go into the next part just to show you that this continues. Just to show you that just because women were getting zapped, this wasn't a crusade against women in general. Everyone got it.
Servants of Satan. A Tale of the Salem Witch Trials. Written by Seabury Quinn. Part 4. George Burroughs, Martyr. Read for you by Edward E. French.
You go, Edward.
In one of his terror tales, Poe tells how the inmates of a lunatic asylum overcame their keepers, locked them in the cells, and proceeded to administer the affairs of the institution according to the dictates of their own diseased minds. Something like this situation, magnified many times, prevailed in the village of Salem, Massachusetts, in the summer and autumn of 1692. In the spring, a number of young women and girls, mostly members of the respected and influential families, began acting in a way that would have led to an inquiry
Of respected family members.
concerning their sanity half a century later.
So even though people might argue that this is about fraud, right? That this is about a money grab. This is not about money grab. That's just way down on the list. The first, again, is that young women are willing to burn down their own society to flex their dominance muscles.
But which induced the authorities of that day to declare them the victims of witchcraft. Encouraged by the Reverend Samuel Parris, pastor of Salem Village Church, and by the magistrates of the district, these afflicted children accused two poor, friendless old women, then a prosperous farmer and his wife, next a universally respected and revered old lady.
Yeah, they're going up the chain. They're pushing boundaries. They're seeing just how far they can go.
The diabolical crime of witchcraft. And in every instance, the accused suffered death. Absolute power was lodged in the hands of this group of hysterical girls by the credulous public officials. No,
they weren't hysterical, though. They were vicious and domineering.
Juvenile despot of antiquity, not even the Queen in Alice in Wonderland, with her customary order, "Off with his head," ever exercised greater authority over the lives and liberties of a community than this company of young women.
Thank you for admitting this, Mr. French. This is what it is about. It's holding power over your fellow man and woman. That's what this is about. That is the motivation, and the only one.
The oldest of whom was 20 years of age. Those first accused were residents of Salem and its environs, people whom the afflicted saw daily. In March 1692, however, came the first long-distance accusations, when the
Wow. So they're saying, wow, if we're going to do it here, let's keep expanding it. Let's go outside our community. This is incredible.
Reverend George Burroughs, residing in Wells in the province of Maine, was cried out upon by the afflicted children. Mr. Burroughs was a man of more than ordinary physique and much more than ordinary character. Short of stature, he was abnormally strong, and combined with a great physical strength, a nature of unusual sweetness and charity. Prior to the Reverend Samuel Parris.
Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, especially in those days, heavy labor was the way people worked, right? So they're talking about a guy who has perfectly good character. He was a good man, and he was an able-bodied man that was absolutely needed by his society. And they're willing to destroy him.
His accession to the Salem pastorate, Burroughs occupied the pulpit, but, unlike most clergymen of his day, he dwelt more upon the love of God than upon his awful wrath.
Now that's important to me too, because you guys know yourselves that a lot of these sermoners talk about hellfire. And this guy was the real deal. He talked about the love of the church.
Iron-souled members of Salem congregation released him in favor of a preacher of sterner doctrine. Incidentally, they allowed him to depart with a considerable portion of his salary unpaid.
So you think he's going to get away with this, right? They loved this guy so much. He was such a good person. They tried to let him escape. He's not going to escape.
Evil fortune seemed to dog Mr. Burroughs's steps. While he was in Salem, his wife died. He remarried shortly after taking up his work in another parish, and his second mate also died. Discouraged, all but despairing, he quit the colony of Massachusetts to take up missionary work in Maine. On April 10, 1692, one John Partridge, a marshal of the latter province, arrested him on a warrant charging witchcraft, trafficking with the evil one, and sundry other diabolical crimes. May 4, he was returned to Salem Village to answer the accusation.
There, that's as far as we need to go. How's that different from today, guys? Right? How is that different from today, from the guys who get MeToo'd, falsely accused? Then they give their apologies and grovel and try and get on with their lives, and then they keep dogging them. They keep dogging them, like Johnny Depp. They never wanted him to get away. So this upstanding member, he thought, he went through all this tragedy. He was a good person his whole life, and still they got him. They got him. And it's all because young girls want it that way. Young girls who were living and leeching off the society that were, let's face it, are predominantly run by the adults that are looking after them. So that's why I talk about the Middle East, by the way, and say, there was a very good reason why they had, 2 women to accuse 1 man. It wasn't about inequality. It's like, because people knew and were willing to admit the nature of women in the past. And here it is for all of us to see over and over again, right? Over and over again. Woman worshiping is devil worshiping. Period.